Okay, let's get started now, and I'm sure other people will join us, but we'll get started now. So today's session is uncovering propaganda, deception, and bias in media reporting using text analytics as a scientific tool for automatic detection. This is part 3. Session 3 explores the underlying concepts of computer-generated text, how to identify it using Wordstat in combination with other statistical tools, how it can be made useful when used in good faith, and how to avoid being deceived by it. The session also compares the intelligence approach of AI versus the actual method of intelligence found in the human brain. The host of today's session, and who hosted the previous two in this series, is Dr. John Aaron. John is a PhD in economics, and BMP is a 26-year veteran of project management and a data science consultant. We'll be able to take questions at the end of the session through the chat feature on your on the Zoom. It's usually on the right-hand side of your screen. So please feel free to answer questions. And now I will turn it over to John.
Okay, Tony, thank you. Hopefully you can hear me. Welcome, everybody. Session number 3. I see some names from before that I recognize, so welcome back. And for those of you that are first time, thank you for joining. Essentially, as Tony mentioned, I don't think I'm going to necessarily repeat every word. I think he described it very well. But I think in terms of details, we want to talk about computer-generated text that can be used for internet chatting, search, or Q&A. And in particular, I'm going to show a little bit, not overly technical, because it involves what's called deep learning, but LSTMs, long short-term memory, that uses recurrent neural nets. And I want to give you an idea of how that works, and also its limitations, because I notice a lot of people are really getting quite emotional and fearful of AI. And this is one of the methods that's frequently used. There is a lot of money going into this right now, this kind of work. And I think we can kind of moderate some of the anxiety, but it is also quite dangerous. And I'm going to be explaining that. I want to talk about how Wordstat can be used to detect this, and how it can be abused and likely will be. And also, I'm going to be talking a little bit about how intelligence in the brain and language and processing works, and comparing that with this. And then also mitigating risks. And then finally, just kind of wrapping up and saying what comes next. And it's related to propaganda, but we're going to be talking about topic modeling and forecasting of sentiment as an economic predictor. And I'll be talking about more about that. So that's the agenda, and we will take Q&A at the end. So where we're kind of heading, and I introduced this in the first session, and that is, by now, if you've attended these sessions, you know that I am not ideological left or right. I'm trying to stay right in the middle, and to force myself to be balanced, I've taken, for instance, Noam Chomsky from the left, and I'll say General Michael Flynn. He's not a right-wing person, but more on the conservative side. And he wrote this book on fifth-generation warfare. And today's topic drills down a little bit more on his side, I would say, because it's dealing with psychological operations. And one of those that he spoke about in this little pamphlet is what he called "See a cat, paint a tiger." And essentially, it's a vehicle for propagandists to establish a new normal by making very small groups of people to appear to be very large groups of people, by simply creating and duplicating documents and so on, and spreading them out with little variation, either in social media or in internet search sites, or it could be these Q&A type of chat, question and answer type of things. And it has a potential to be a very effective propaganda tool if you don't know about it. If you know about it, as with anything, you kind of neutralize it. And that's what we're doing. And text analytics is a very helpful tool for detecting this. The other thing, and this is an underlying type of risk that I see in its usage, is the ability not just to see a cat, paint a tiger, and make something bigger than it appears to be, but to be able to take single source documents of dogma for instance, like a Mein Kampf from Germany or a Communist Manifesto of Karl Marx, and basically use that as a reference, and then from there use these methods of computer-generated text to generate many spokes of a hub of these documents and distribute it and kind of drive a normalized way of thinking that favors the attitude of these kind of things. And you know, certainly Nazi Germany is one of the real benchmarks of propaganda, right? And communism as well. And these kind of documents were used, but now with all this computer generation capability of varying it a little bit, so it looks a little different, but it contains the same basic message. That is a risk that I'm going to be talking about. And again, bots and AI written articles support this by a very small number of people potentially pushing large quantities of articles over the internet very inexpensively. So you get this proliferation of these kind of things. So that's the overall risk and why I'm putting it under the header of propaganda. And how might we detect this, right? That's a thing. So kind of a big picture, and you know, this is going to be my third and probably my final discussion of propaganda per se and deception. But you know, throughout our two sessions, what we've done is that we've kind of looked at various propaganda techniques as individual items. But we've also approached things as Bayesians. And when you look at things like this is a Bayesian belief network, it is not a Wordstat multidimensional scaling, although it looks a little bit different. This is taking what I'll call a base case of looking at text and trying to assign probabilities to it based on validation, not just text, but also does somebody have firsthand knowledge where they see these things, right? And when you look at the big picture of this globalism that Mike Flynn talks about, what you see is evidence of a very large strategy where propaganda is a major component of it. Now, there's other legs of this I'm not showing, but the critical piece down here, and I'm going to be kind of moving this, is that when you see in this in context of all the things that are going on, from banking to digitalization to electioneering to things of that nature. And again, there's theory behind this. Noam Chomsky, Mike Flynn, others that speak to this. All we're doing is testing and trying to use science to the validation of these hypotheses. But when you look at this and you put it together in totality, where is all this going? And again, we have to be thinking probability-wise. Could some of these be wrong? Absolutely. There's probabilities to all these. But when I look at a base case, which is the most likely scenario, what it points to is control. And this idea of complete centralization, control of finances, control of consumption, control of production, submission to authority, reduced population, different population, things of that nature. And probably the scariest of all to me is this one, and that is the control of thought. And that is kind of the theme of this topic that I'm following here. And again, I'm not ideological. I'm just trying to be a scientist that does text mining of these things and tries to look at it from a probabilistic standpoint using Bayes' theorem and other things. So if I kind of go back and I say, how did I get here in terms of computer generated text? If you attended some of the prior sessions, you'll notice that I sort of stumbled into some of these things. I was very much going way back against the lockdowns, the economics of the lockdowns. And when I taught data science, I had my students group into states about using CDC data and doing predictions of opening states, because I'm an economist, and I use a thing called the Preston curve, where what was happening was that the economic deterioration leads to life expectancy deterioration, if you look at Preston's data. And so my message to city managers, and I worked through the university to do these things, was to say, don't lock down, find a way through this thing. And ever since then, I been involved in this whole thing with the COVID and so on, because one thing led to the next, it led to the next, it led to the next. And finally, I got to the point where I saw that the CDC data that I was touting was incorrect. Their recommendations didn't make sense to me and things of this nature. So without going too far back, what I did, and those of you may remember, is that I took a lot of social media and internet search data in text, and I put them through these analyzers. And then, because so much of this was tied to the CDC, I took their websites and I scraped those, and I made those into documents. Then I started doing some comparisons. And probably that one of the most telling things to me was that another theme of this series has been used good decision making, and good decision making always means selecting from a broad range of alternatives, choices, and evaluating pluses and minuses and pros and cons of every alternative. And when you have censorship, it's very hard to do that. And so what was going on is I noticed that anytime I did an internet search, I had a very, very, very high recommendation for instance, taking the vaccine. But when I would do social media things, there was a much lower propensity for that. And I started saying, well, what's going on here? And then when you look at topic analysis, you see these kind of things. And so this kind of led me on this trail of looking at certain documents, such as the CDC website, such as others, and wondering and recognizing that so many of the numbers were wrong they were proposing during the lockdowns. I started getting pretty uncomfortable with it, and I started doing my own analysis. And what I found that there was high correlation over here, if you kind of look in here, between the CDC, what it was saying, and some of these websites. All the top search engines using the page rank were highly correlated with that particular document. So there was not very much pros and cons for good decision making. And when I was doing just the analysis, I was forced to go to social media, which I don't use, right? I've never been a big social media person, and but to get a balanced perspective, I had to do that. So what was going on then was this first observation. And so what I did was I took, as with all of these, quite a bit of topic analysis and key phrases that were coming out of these here. And that you can see for from the CDC, there was heavily, currently, it used to be lockdowns and deaths from COVID, and then it went to the vaccine and so on. And so what you get are these kind of topics that you can mine from these. And so for me, the big risk for society, for all of us, is this idea of taking these centralized documents as dogma, and then using these, and from these, using those as a hub to replicate these philosophies that are just ubiquitous and go all over, right? And all of a sudden, people start thinking a certain way through repetition, and we don't challenge things, right? And my perspective is, again, I'm not political. I'm just, if there's one thing I'm strong about, it's good decision making, people making good decisions. And when you have a block and everything is slanted one way or another, people don't do that. And so I'm promoting good decision making. That's it. And how we can kind of recognize when things are steered towards away from good decision making. And so when you're dealing with Wordstat, one of the tools you can use is to take, the normal list of documents you bring in, and then when you do topic modeling, you can run your topics, but then transpose the matrix. So for instance, you can export from Wordstat into a matrix, an Excel sheet, and then you transpose. So rather than having the documents on your left side going down as a column, you can have the documents as kind of like your X variable, right? And then what you've got is this kind of thing. So what you can do then is you can measure the correlation between documents on certain topics. And so, for instance, and again, this is a little bit of a review because we really used this slide last time, but it's fundamental to where we're going with today's new message. And so what you've got then is a kind of a threshold that if anything had a greater than 100 mentions per 10K on recommendation, it was very clear that was what you were trying to predict, right, as a variable. And so what also happened was that I ran some, because I one thing leads to the next, and I start more experiments and do this. is that I then started more recently, some of those documents go back a couple of years when I first started doing these webinars. And when I started taking the documents on the internet, and then I started running correlation with the CDC documents, you see very much that you have certain, the highest page rank ones tended to have the highest correlation with the recommendation, for instance, to take the vaccine, while saying that there's no counter to it, right? It was a very anemic counter argument to it. And in fact, as I've shown, that there's a fair amount of evidence that a lot of people have been severely hurt or killed by that. And there were other alternatives. And it would have been very good for give people a broad range of alternatives rather than just steering them that, or steering people into lockdowns, right? It's not just the vaccine I'm talking about, it's CDC recommendations in general. And so the topic that I really want to expand on then is, having that background, is this idea that you see a lot now written about AI kind of Q&A type of tools that are coming out there. And there's a lot of money come in this. And what that means is that you ask a question and then you get a response from the machine, right? That answers your question. And in this case, I asked the question, should you get the COVID vaccination? And it gave me this response. And it turned out that it's very much tied to the CDC website. And so I said, well, that's rather interesting. And how do they do this? And how do they make this a bit different, right? And every article is not the same. Well, the background is this, that you have things like Bing Chat, the AI-powered search engine. You have all these things that are cropping up for ChatGPT, for GPT-4, things of this nature. And what they're doing is that they're tied to deep learning models, algorithms that in fact use single documents as references. And then they tie that back in to make it look like it's sort of original, or a little variation between them. It's usually when you get a correlation between documents of about 0.6 that you start saying, okay, that's a good chance that it's all it's doing is just referencing another document. And so there's a proliferation of these things coming out now. And the danger, of course, is that it is all slanted towards a single philosophy. And that is the problem. So what did I do? Well, I took my latest experiment was I took a more recent copy. I did a scrape of the CDC website more recently. I did that on March. I took a date there and I said, okay, I'm going to take this document, which this represents this scraping here. And what I'm going to do now is I am going to run it through an LSTM, long short-term memory deep learning. And I use MATLAB for that. They have a text analytics tool. And I also use MATLAB a lot for the scraping of sites. And so you get this document. Then when you run it through one of these deep learning LSTMs, it generates a document that is very similar, but a little bit different. And so I generated 10 of these, right? I ran these. And so how did that work? Well, and you can see it reads pretty well, right? It's all computer generated text, but it's referencing something, but it is the way it's doing it statistically. It's not just taking and scraping. What it's doing is that it is essentially, and you can see I've got some correlations here between the CDC and the documents that I ran that are called LSTMs. And you see they all hit that. Some of them hit higher, some hit lower, but it all kind of comes around when you see a correlation, Pearson correlation coefficient of about 0.6 between words. You know that it's probably a candidate that this thing could be generated by a computer, right? From a single source document. And so what I was doing is just kind of doing validation of what I had seen before, trying to, small sample, 10, but nonetheless, and the way I did it was this. All right, so these are the documents. You see, I did topic modeling on the documents and looked at these, tried to see how closely they were aligned to this and so on. But the theory behind this is where there is a fair amount of money right now. It's called LSTM and long short-term memory. What it does, it uses recurrent neural nets. Now, neural nets are a form of what's called deep learning or machine learning. It's a bit different than using more regression style type of machine learning methods, but it's used for sequential data, time series at times. And what it does is that it, to make it easy, I mean, you know, basically this is a net and it runs a prediction on this for you'll get this periodic data. But the real message to keep in mind is that what it does, it statistically predicts words from prior words. So what it does is that it basically says, okay, I've got these things here. And when it sees a pattern of one word following another word, it learns from that, and then it makes predictions based on that. It also knows that if it's the first word of a sentence and so on like that. So it has this, and it basically gets rid of everything else except for these relationships between a word and its next word. But it's statistical or stochastic. So that means you're going to get some variation between these. And it's hard to tell because they are highly correlated. And it gives that variation that leads one to believe that it's a separate kind of document. And so this is a case of where I trained these, and you can see that this is showing a cost function going down. So it was learning from here. And that means that there was patterns in the data of one word following the next on a regular basis, statistically, that it learned from. And then it stabilized, and then I had enough that I then generated the actual text forms from that, okay? And so that's kind of how it is done. And if you look out there, there's a lot of money going into research organizations and universities on this, on how to make this type of thing operate. Now, you know, so the theory of all this is really not that hard. It really follows kind of along what we've already talked about. But what I've also noticed, the second objective that I want to deal with is this idea that, are these things really intelligent, right? You know, do you have a lot to fear by all of a sudden the machine knowing everything, being this omniscient type of, you know, type of thing, like a Ray Kurzweil kind of scenario, you might say. And so what I've also done, and I've been doing this for years, I've had a definite fascination. I'm not a neuroscientist. I'm not a doctor, physician, doctor, I guess, but I'm not a physician. And so I used, and this is a person I interviewed, Joachim Fuster, who wrote a lot. He's just a wonderful man, and he was on my bucket list of life. I called him, and he granted me a 30-minute interview because I told him, I said, look, before I kick off, I want to talk to you because I loved your book so much. They're medical books, but I got through them. And it explains a lot about how the brain really works. And he, and I don't want to quote him because I told him, I said, I'm not formally interviewing you. I just want to talk to you. And he didn't surprise me. He said, look, this thing about artificial intelligence, it's not going to work. And you know, and you can read, after you read how all the brain works, you get a good feeling why it won't. So I don't really want to quote him because I told him I was not going to interview him, and I don't want to do that. But anyway, the way the brain kind of works and why it differs from what you've just seen with this recurrent neural net. And surprisingly, what you're going to see is that the way the brain works, what Normand and the Provalis team has done in terms of some of the modeling of the multidimensional scaling and some of the topics, at least at a high level, there's a lot of similarities the way Wordstat is designed and the way the brain really works, surprisingly, right? I'm not sure Normand and his team had that in mind, but anyway, what happens is you get, in our brains, we do get the idea of certain concepts and frequency of words that tend to map to others. see a similarity, right? Between the correlation and multidimensional scaling here as it goes back. So when in fact our senses get hit with things, so these concepts kind of jump one and link one to the other. And so we have these kind of embedded in us. So cherries turn red as they get ripe. You get this kind of jumping around, from one point to the next. And so what it does, in fact, in terms of language, this was the language part of Dr. Fuster's book, is you do and have these concepts that kind of come together that have this kind of correlational relationship. But that said, the idea of intelligence, well, that's a bit of a different story, right? Where, and this comes from his book here, where what you have is that layers, you have people argue about this, but there's like 6 layers in the brain in terms, and where it comes from is all these are like neurons, these cells. Now this is from a mammalian brain where it goes layer 1, layer 2, layer 3, layer 4, layer 5. I'm going to hang up just a minute, hang up that phone. Hold on. I'm at home today and these salespeople bothering me, but nothing against salesmen, right? But they always seem to find me. Anyway, so you've got this. So here's where you get your data from your senses. All your senses, they come in and they drive here. And so you get this kind of interaction, and there's a thing called Hebbian learning, and that is cells that fire together, wire together. And that's how you get this relationship, right, with the frequency that's going on here. But the big thing, the big difference is that the way it works is that intelligence comes from, first of all, we're born with some phylogenetic memory. In other words, when we're born, we already have memory in us on how to breathe, how to eat, and certain natural things. That all comes from memory. But it goes up into very, very sophisticated groupings that allow very, very abstract things like planning and dealing with concepts and programs and acts that take us, that are both bottom up and top down. And Dr. Fuster, and I would say I would agree, and probably many do, and I think some of the people like founders of Apple, Wozniak and so on, they agree that artificial intelligence is just not going to do this. It takes 9 months to basically develop something that has this level of sophistication. And so I would say that based on anything I've seen, that the notions of what you've seen with recurrent neural nets and things of that nature, I wouldn't worry about having these highly intelligent machines, but that doesn't mean that this isn't dangerous, right? But the other aspect of this, I think, to consider is Gödel's incompleteness theorem. In that the idea, Gödel was a mathematician that essentially proved that these attempts at systems of axioms could not be complete. And there was a very interesting person, John Boyd, who wrote, among other things, Organic Design for Command and Control. And what he observed about Gödel, he said, furthermore, according to Gödel's proof and Heisenberg uncertainty principle and the second law of thermodynamics, this is a key point. One cannot determine the character or nature of a system within itself. Now, Gödel spoke really about mathematics and arithmetic, piano arithmetic, and so on. But the idea that can we as humans within our own system develop something that's equally complex, and that raises a real doubt in my mind that I'm kind of, a lot of people don't like to expand upon Gödel's thoughts, but I think that that is a consideration. And when it comes to text analytics and so on, I think there's still more ground we can cover and so on. But to have the actual intelligence of text and being able to come up with concepts and this kind of thing, dealing with this kind of complexity, right, where it's kind of moving up here, I just don't see it happening. And certainly that's my opinion. And I kind of just leave it at that. So the idea here is that I view that it's unlikely that in the near term that attempts to recreate human intelligence will be successful, but computer-generated text as a propaganda tool is very dangerous. And for the reasons I talked about taking these centralized documents and then proliferating them on the internet. And then what happens through repetition is that people tend to absorb this, and it starts to control the way we think. And so, you know, there's a side of me that man is to be free, and that this kind of goes against every grain I've ever been taught, is the idea that we would have this system that is imposed on us, right? And it's coming down through modifying our psychology and so on, and coming down and allowing total control over us. And the counter to that, to me, is just awareness, because so much of this propaganda, and I'm sort of wrapping up general thoughts, you know, on the 3 lectures that we've had. The idea, so much of this propaganda is we're kind of doing it to ourselves, and awareness becomes the really the antidote to it. And you know, so what's happened is I kind of wrap this up, and I suspect I'll have quite a bit of time left, but I'm going to show some new things. But the idea, and this is a theme that we've talked about, is that much of the propaganda that opens us up to this kind of thinking, to be kind of programmed and follow a recommendation that comes from us, is tied to fear. And we used Irv Janis and Leon Mann's model on this. The idea that when we are put and made afraid, right, that makes us very, very vulnerable to make bad decisions. And only by asking the questions, I'm not going to repeat the first questions that we talked about in the first 2 sessions, because I've talked about Janis and Mann quite a bit on that. But we have to be able to evaluate alternatives, weigh the pros and cons, and get through the fear that is imposed on us to make rational choices. And the other thing that's been the form of propaganda that has been put on us. It's time tested. It goes all the way back to Edward Bernays, going back in the 1920s and so on. Bernays was a nephew of Sigmund Freud. So these techniques have evolved quite heavily, and fear is a very, very important driver. The other important driver here is programs that are out there to prevent organized resistance against this. So you keep in mind, just like I have to agree with Michael Flynn, your enemy is your neighbor is not your enemy. And you realize that these systems are coming in to steer us basically to a desired mode of operation, not necessarily to our own individual best interest. And so that's kind of the, you know, and the other piece of this. So vigilant decision making, being able to have your own personal antidotes to this is very important. And keeping in mind that what happens is that what we know is that there are 2 sides to us, as human beings. There's the intellectual, but there's also the animal. There's reality, there's delusion. There's the individual, there's the herd. There's the rational scientific, then there's the psychotic. And the use of propaganda to exploit human vulnerabilities is very much geared to that. And you know, text is a very, very good way to catch these kind of things. And it's also a way to exploit this, right? So awareness becomes very important. So you know, we've given through these different sessions a lot of methods of detecting it with text analytics, the linkage between the psychology of this and how you can use text for that. You know, certainly by using Wordstat in today's discussion, looking at the correlation between documents. So, you know, I guess I could have hit a little bit harder the idea that when you're using Wordstat, what you can do is take these single documents. It could be Mein Kampf, it could be the Communist Manifesto, it could be the CDC, whatever it is, and then you start looking at different media of different types. And you know, here's the difference between social media and the internet. and looking at the correlations when you do topic modeling on these types of things, or just extracting phrases. And that's a very, very powerful new set of functions that Wordstat has given to be ability to extract topics, the ability to extract phrases, because that allows you then to spot these kind of things. So if you think, you know, it could be Wikipedia, it could be anything out there that is you know, prolific in terms of guiding people and giving people questions and answers to their questions, there's a good chance that it is tied to that and is intended to steer you to a specific way of thinking, not necessarily to answer a specific question. There's underlying motives, right? I think is the possibility there. Now, you know, I could come across like a paranoid person, I guess, but you know, there's enough evidence to support this. That's not just from text, but when I see something that a person, at least a firsthand account of some of these, then it tends to go into my Bayesian network that I built here. Okay, so given that, what's next? And you know, I think I've pretty much done everything I can in terms of spotting propaganda, laying a foundation for that. But where I see the next area of interest is time series modeling and prediction from text, and this relates to sentiment also. You know, we said that sentiment, negative sentiment, is a very, very good indicator of generating fear, right? And so that's how we used it in that context. But where it's going next is that in the background, what I've been doing every day since August 29th is I have been taking headlines from a balanced sample of left, right-leaning, centrist-leaning articles, and looking at different websites, getting the data, collecting those words and headline titles, and then doing the Provalis sentiment dictionary, positive words, negative words. And it comes up with some interesting patterns. So negative words, you kind of see this, right? It's kind of this trend. And this is actual frequency. And if I look at the rate per 10,000, it looks like this. And if I look at positive words, there's more variation to it, right? And so the question becomes, how useful is this? You know, and what kind of underlying forensic information is in here, if any, right? And so, for instance, if I take a look and I do a Fourier analysis, which is really taking sine waves and trying to decipher from this positive words, that's what this is. What you see is a pattern, albeit faint, a pattern of cycles that occur about every 100 days. And, you know, I'm a former radar technician, so faint patterns to me can still mean something, and from reflected, you know, radar signals and so on. But, you know, it's these kind of things that are there and potentially. And if I look, that's positive words. And if I look at negative words, well, I see this kind of, we're in the midst of kind of like this mega cycle of negativity that is increasing. And this is started at 8/29, 2022, and this is today. Right over here, you see the cycle of this trend of negativity, which I believe is tied to fear, right? It drives that. That's coming out of the media. And that's a balanced sample. I've tried to hold a constant sample. So, you know, at the end of August, I'll have a year's worth of data. And so where I'm heading with this, and where you may have some interest in seeing this presented, is the ability to tie this to other things of relative importance, such as economics. So for instance, if I take a normalized plot of the Dow Jones Industrial Average, which is shown in red, versus negative words per day, you kind of see this here. But look at positive words. Well, there's a certain fit potentially that exists, and perhaps this offers some insight to prediction of variables that might be very useful. And then when I combine this with potentially, now here's where I've used in Wordstat, I do topic modeling of these headlines, and I'm going to cycle through this a little bit just to show you the kind of patterns you get when you do topic modeling. And so, for instance, here's the Russia-Ukraine war. You kind of see this. It has peaks and valleys. So let's cycle through some of these. and you'll start to see some recurring patterns. Here's one on financial collapse. This was a pattern. So you see long around in March, there was a lot talking about financial collapse, right? So the sensitivity of this tool of topic modeling is quite good. The ability to discern these kind of peaks and valleys. Here's one on electric vehicles, the elections in Arizona. Okay, that was a topic I mined. I did this for all topics, not just political or medical or whatever. So you see these kind of things here. And so the question becomes, here's Donald Trump, okay, right? Here's one on super donors, that Sam Bankman kind of thing, right? So the question then becomes, if there are recurring patterns in the media and they're leaving breadcrumbs, forensic breadcrumbs for us to follow, where could that lead? It could be useful for prediction. It could be useful for a number of things, right? So here you see Elon Musk, right? So these types of things. So these are the things that happens when you start combining time series analysis with text analytics, the ability to use that, and maybe perhaps combine this with other financial indicators such as volatility indices and things of that nature to come up with better prediction models using machine learning. And I know I have my colleague from Minitab, Mikhail Golovnia, on right now, and he and I talk about these and work together on these kind of things. And this will probably be the next webinar that we would give to try and just do on a good faith investigation. Can we use these forensic signals in ways to give us insights? Perhaps people unintentionally are leaving these trails for us to follow, right? So that's kind of what's coming next. So I think, Tony, this has been a little bit shorter. It's 11:40.
No, you're good. You're good.
Okay. So I think that's all I have. So if there's questions, feel free.
Okay. Thank you very much, John. If you have questions, please use the chat feature. It should be on the right-hand side of your screen, and ask your question. When we see high correlations between CDC recommendations and websites,
Yeah.
is it a proof of the existence of dogma or propaganda, or is it the result of a successful coordinated effort to pass a message for public health reasons? Can correlations really differentiate successful campaigns versus computer-generated tigers?
Yeah. Well, it's an interesting question. And so I would say that it comes down to this. The reason why I would call that propaganda is because it failed the test of Janus and Mann, and that is that there is not the counter argument, right? If I go to browser searches and I see a very, very one-sided type of item, and the cons of things are never discussed, or they're prohibited through censorship, then I get suspicious because it fails the Janus and Mann test. So your point is, you definitely have a point. If you want to call that successful, I didn't. I chose not to. But you're certainly entitled to, and that's up to you. But I use Janus and Mann as my criteria.
Okay. Do you compare Wordstat topic modeling with any other types of topic modeling, such as LDA?
Leighton Dirichlet?
Yeah. Or any other types, or any other tools you've used?
Yeah, I've used, for instance, MATLAB uses LDA. I've used it, certainly. I use many, many different tools, but when the kind of metrics that I am showing here are very robust for me in topic modeling. Where I showed you this time series plot, this little thing here, the ability to get this type of thing, I use Wordstat for this. I mean, I have run topic modeling. In fact, even on this data set, I used LDA. I ended up going back to the Wordstat. Now, Wordstat does have the ability to use LDA. I believe there's scripts in there that are in the tool. You can use some of these using Python if you like, but I felt fine just using factor analysis or whatever that is used on this in the topic modeling of and phrases feature. So that Wordstat is my preference for this.
Okay. I'm looking for questions. Does anybody else out there have any questions about? Somebody must have questions. No? Norma, do you have any other questions? Okay, use your mic or comments. Doesn't seem to be. Okay, John, I guess the message to me is that's pretty complete.
Yeah. I think so. I think we've done a fair job of covering a lot of the concepts and so on. And so it's time to move on to the next topic.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much for everybody attending. This is being recorded. So if you want to revisit it, and as far as I'm concerned, there were some concepts here that I'd like to go back and revisit and take a closer look at. Please, please use it. There's a question in chat.
Okay.
I'm sorry. I'm trying to find it. Hang on. Meeting chat. I got something wrong. Oh yeah. Okay. I just have an issue with my computer here. Oh, there's a couple of questions here.
Let me look.
If you were to discover a strong trend for sources to assert that air was essential for human life, would you reject the message? If not, what would persuade you?
Say that again.
Okay. I think this goes back sort of to the first question. If you were to discover a strong trend for sources to assert that air was essential for human life, would you reject the message? If not, what would persuade you? Okay, go ahead. Open your mic, Lawrence, and ask the question. Maybe the way we're reading it is not the best.
Okay, hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Sure.
No, I was a bit concerned that we have to have some way of deciding between the truth and falsity of assertions. And mere fact that there's a correlation between, say, a CDC recommendation and what turns up in public media, the broadcast, social media, and so on, does not show that the CD recommendations are false. The decision to decide on the truth or falsity is going to be made, or should be made, on the basis of the available evidence and logic. Are you asserting that most people in the media are not capable of making those decisions?
No, I'm glad. You're wonderful. I'm glad you clarified that. I'm kind of assuming that some of you saw some of the previous webinars I gave on this topic. No, you're absolutely right. Science. In fact, one of the first ones we talked about was science, hypothesis testing, and so on. And the problem with the hold on, I gotta close this. Darn phone calls. I'm at home. I'm not at my office. But no, you raise an outstanding point. And the whole concept of this thing has been towards science. And I've always been very, very reluctant. The CDC, I mean, when I taught data science, I used their data extensively. And I had all my students use it. I totally believed in it. And then what happened was with the actual COVID, they totally, at the end of 2021, it was like the start of 2022, they totally redacted all those COVID deaths and labeling them as such. And so I became very suspicious towards that. And then what I noticed was that the idea of the vaccinations, all of the ideas of promoting the vaccine without any consideration really of the real hazards of that. And if you and last time I gave this presentation, I showed Edward Dowd, who did a statistical analysis showing the number of excess deaths that are related to this vaccine, and so there was really no dealing with that with the CDC. So Lawrence, I totally respect what you're saying. I mean, you raise a great point, but I'm speaking in the context of some of the prior type of information that I presented previously, and so it was tied to that. But the idea of causation, of cause and effect, of modeling, and so on, your point is very, very important. The idea that we take hypotheses and we test those and we go through that is an extremely important point. So I am not out of the box saying that all journalists are wrong or anything like that. I'm dealing very probabilistically, and that is that if I consider a base case, that what I would say, if something is the most likely, this is the pattern that I tend to be seeing. So, but I'm glad you brought it up, because you're absolutely right in what you say.
Thank you.
You bet.
Another question. Thank you, Lawrence. Another question, John. I got the impression that the correlations you showed were between short phrases. Is it not possible that some of those phrases are simply fundamental terms? That I get that wrong? And to clarify, what I mean by the question is that some phrases could be just basic building blocks of discussing a topic and may be neutral in that respect.
Well, you're right in that most phrases come out as like 2 to 3 words, right? And after that, then they start to not really be observable phrases anymore. That is an observation. But there are correlations between documents, so that would be a really a good thing for further research, I would say. I respect that question, definitely. Good catch.
Could I raise a second point?
Yeah, Lauren, go ahead.
Does word order matter? I sometimes cite the example of, "You do not shower often enough, but I love you," to "I love you, but you do not shower often enough." They have very different meanings.
I love you. Say it again.
Okay. You do not shower often enough, but I love you is something which could be said. Yeah.
Yeah.
But it could be, "I love you, but you do not shower often enough." The words are identical, slightly different order, meaning entirely different.
Yeah, you're right. That is. So I think that, Lawrence, and the state of the art. I mean, think about the state of the art of topic modeling and what's going on with the words, the continual improvement that's going on. I think there is continued research in this area, the ability to take nuances of language like that and being able to develop tools to point out things like that. You're absolutely right. That's the nature of language. I think I agree with you.
Yeah.
But I think the state of the art of where we are with language right now is with those kind of limitations.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
I have another question. How can topic modeling be inserted into automated recommender systems used by news sites? I don't quite know what that means. Do you?
I'm thinking it through. How can topic modeling be inserted into recommender? How about if the person explains it?
HV, can you explain this? What's a recommender? What's a recommender system? I don't know what that is. Go ahead.
Like an automated system that recommends specific articles to the users. So I was just thinking in terms of like filter bubbles and everything, if it is maybe a strategy to use topic modeling to go and recommend different topics to users that are at risk of interest.
Yeah. Well, would you start with a base of text on there? So like what I'm showing right now is, and I haven't updated this in actually a couple of months, but I ran topic modeling on all the news articles that I discussed with you. So this is the kind of stuff you get, right? And it comes from phrases where you have common phrases. And so you get this. So you would have to start with some sort of a strategy. So what is it that you're, would you want to take topics and then select a subset of these topics to know that these are things that are important to people? And then from there, if people had text, you could extract and determine which topics they may be touching on, and then write a program and saying, if they touch on this topic, then give them that kind of an answer. I mean, if that's where you're heading, I think that could work, right? Basically it's almost like what you're doing, you're starting and saying, what are the things that kind of come out and, that is in text, in print, or is being spoken that you convert to text and then do that. And then if a script or something comes in and it matches one of these topics, then you would have like an if-then type of thing. So let's say, if someone filled out a form, like in a doctor's office, and they said, do you explain what's wrong with you or something like that. And then it matched a certain grouping of topics, right? Then you would program saying if then, kind of a decision tree type of thing. I think that would be feasible. Is that what you're talking about?
Yes, exactly.
Okay. Yeah. Sure.
Laurie here. I published something on that before 2000.
What do you do?
I published a paper on that before the year 2000. I can't remember quite the day, but 1995 or something like that. We were doing a survey on nurses, on their attitude to certain things, and we decided that we had to feed back to the, 650 or 700 nurses who took part, were our respondents.
Yeah.
The judgments that they made, what our conclusions were. And then, once they'd received the report on it, they were asked about a month later to say what they thought of the report. And none of them spotted it was computer produced. There was over 700 of them, I think it was, and not a single one spotted that the report had been computer produced. They thought it had been done by a nurse researcher.
Okay.
Well, thank you. That we are coming up to the top of the clock. Not that we have to stop that, but stop now. But we do this time. We don't have any more questions. I'm sorry, but before I didn't have my chat box open up high enough, so I couldn't see the stuff in there. But that looks like all the questions we have for now. So, right. John, do you have any couple of words to wrap up? And before you do, just everybody who's still on the call, take a look on our Twitter feed and on our website for upcoming Lunch and Learns. We'll be announcing them in the next little while, and hopefully we'll get John back to discuss his work on headlines on news sites, probably end of August or in September, and hopefully we'll have some things before that. So, John, go ahead.
Final words. Yeah, and I think it sort of relates to what Lawrence may have been pointing to, and that is, I came into this with zero political leanings, with no recommendations whatsoever. The only recommendation I make is good decision making. And that is, regardless of who says what, you weigh the pros and cons of everything. You try to get past this idea of fear and try and keep yourself rational. And when you do that, you've done the right thing. Regardless if you stayed in your house, if you wore a mask, if you took the vaccine, that matters not to me. What matters to me is to use principles of good decision making. And what we've been able to do with this is to try and show patterns of the way that people are put under stress and fear and steered towards things that might not be in their best interest. If it's in their best interest, if they evaluate their alternatives and make a choice one way or another. But if they don't, and they're short-circuiting that, following the Janus and Mann model, then in fact, they've done the wrong thing. in my opinion. And what we've done is that we've tried to take the ideological spectrum of both the left, such as Noam Chomsky, and more to the right, such as Michael Flynn, that have written about propaganda and brought all that under the umbrella. So I've tried to keep this absolutely dead center as much as I can. And that was the intent. So the focus is decision making, regardless of which way you choose.
Okay, well, thank you very much. And thank you very much, John. It's been very instructive. And you probably don't get a chance to see these things, but you've got a lot of compliments from the people who have tuned in today. So thank you very much. Work hard on this, because we look on the data there we have in front of us, because we look forward to the results in the next few months.
Yeah. Okay. All right,
Thank you.
everybody. Thank
Thanks,
you.
everybody.
Good day. Bye-bye now.
Bye-bye.